In a packed university hall, Pam Bondi was publicly mocked by a well-known liberal journalist, but her quiet, devastating response turned the entire crowd on its head. It was just after 6 p.m. in Tampa. The university's main auditorium at the Marshall Student Center was packed. Nearly every seat was filled, with students balancing notebooks on their laps, faculty members sitting stiffly in pressed shirts, in a smattering of locals who'd come out of curiosity rather than affiliation. The flyer had promised a sharp discussion: the role of media and public service in a divided America. At the center table, under the glaring white lights, sat 4 panelists, among them Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, dressed in a smart navy blazer and calm confidence. To her left was Cameron Holt, a nationally syndicated journalist, known for her biting segments on late-night news panels and her unapologetically liberal takes. She wore a sleek black turtleneck and a barely there smirk. The moderator, Professor Brent Holloway, stood to introduce the guests. His tone was diplomatic, trying hard not to favor one side over the other. The discussion was supposed to last 90 minutes. Part debate, part Q&A. And hopefully, according to the university's PR team, an opportunity for mutual understanding. At first it all went according to plan. The panelists answered questions about press responsibility, freedom of speech, and how to rebuild trust in institutions. Cameron talked passionately about the importance of holding public figures accountable, while Bondi spoke firmly about due process and not rushing to judgment. In the court of public opinion, the audience listened intently. Phone stayed mostly down. That was rare. But the mood began to shift about halfway through. A student asked how politicians and media figures alike could better model respect for young people watching at home. It was a broad, open-ended question, but it gave Cameron an opening. She leaned toward her microphone, and without even glancing at Bondi, said with a tight smile, "Well, maybe not by defending failed administrations and promoting your look more than your record." A few people in the crowd chuckled. Some gasped, others just looked down, suddenly unsure whether this was still a panel or the beginning of a very public takedown. Pam didn't react right away. She kept her eyes on the moderator, who had frozen for just a second. Maybe hoping someone would change the subject. Maybe hoping Cameron would walk it back. She didn't. Cameron doubled down. "I mean, when your biggest headline in recent years is about a TV appearance instead of policy reform. That says something, doesn't it?" Now the laughter wasn't nervous. It was more certain, emboldened. The crowd had started picking sides. Pam finally moved. She reached for her water, took a small sip, and leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together. She hadn't said a word yet, but somehow the attention had shifted back to her. The moderator cleared his throat. "Miss Bondi, would you like to respond?" She waited a beat, like she was choosing which part of that sentence to answer, or whether to answer at all. The pause felt longer than it was. But Cameron wasn't finished. And what came next changed the energy in the entire room. Cameron shifted in her chair, like she was getting ready for round 2. She crossed one leg over the other, turned slightly toward the audience, and said with a grin that barely masked her intent, "Look, I get it. Rebranding is a smart move. Politics doesn't always age well. But if we're going to talk about public service, let's not pretend looking polished on cable news is the same as having a legacy." The words hung there loud, clear, sharp. This time there were no gasps. Just silence, the kind that sneaks into a room right before something breaks. A few students turned to each other. With raised eyebrows, one professor in the second row scribbled something down, probably a note for class. Even the moderator looked uncomfortable now. Pam still hadn't responded. Cameron glanced over, not just with challenge, but with expectation. She was waiting for a slip. A snap, something she could run with. Something dramatic enough to trend. Before the panel even ended, Pam shifted slightly in her seat. Her face neutral, she didn't frown. Didn't flinch. Just looked up and calmly met Cameron's eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice soft but firm. Was there a question in that? The room stirred. A low, scattered laugh emerged, not mocking but surprised. The kind of reaction people give when someone decides not to play the game everyone else is expecting. But Cameron wasn't done poking. "I'm just saying," she replied, pressing forward with that same smirk. "When people think of you, they remember a public figure who defended some of the most controversial political stances in recent memory. They remember the glossy interviews, not the courtroom wins. That's worth pointing out." Pam turned slightly, facing the moderator. Her expression steady. "I've always welcomed disagreement," she said, "but personal attacks aren't conversation. They're noise." Cameron raised both brows. "Oh, come on, Pam. If you're going to serve the public, you should be able to take the heat. Or are we calling everything personal now?" There it was, the bait. But Pam didn't bite. "I've taken plenty of heat," she replied, voice even. "Some fair, some not. That comes with the job. But I don't believe in tearing people down just to get a few claps from a room." It didn't get applause, not yet. But it landed. There was a noticeable shift in the air. Not dramatic, just still. Cameron's smile faltered for the first time. She looked like she was about to respond. But the moderator quickly intervened. "Let's open this next question to the full panel," he said, fumbling with the index cards in front of him. But the question never got read. A student toward the back stood up without waiting for the mic. "Actually, I'd like to hear more from Miss Bondi," she said. "How do you respond when you're criticized like that? Not just tonight, but in general?" A pause. Pam turned toward the voice. The student couldn't have been older than 20. Jeans, oversized sweatshirt. Arms crossed tightly, the way students sit when they are both nervous and fed up. Pam nodded once. "I'd be glad to answer that," she said, standing slowly from her seat. And just like that, the dynamics shifted. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted anyone. But suddenly all eyes were on her. The room leaned forward, not out of excitement, but curiosity. Everyone wanted to know what she was about to say. But instead of biting back, Pam did something no one in the room saw coming. Pam walked toward the podium with a kind of quiet certainty that didn't ask for attention. It simply earned it. No dramatic gestures, no expression of irritation. Just calm, measured steps. Like she had nothing to prove and everything to say. She adjusted the microphone with one hand and glanced toward the back of the room, as if she was speaking to someone beyond the stage. Maybe even beyond the walls of that university. "I spent years in courtrooms," she began, "years sitting across from people who did things most of you will hopefully never have to see or understand. I've had to look victims in the eye, at kids' moms, retirees, and tell them I'd do everything in my power to fight for them. And then I had to actually do it." No one made a sound. Even Cameron looked unsure of where this was going. Pam continued, her tone steady. I didn't take that job because it was glamorous. And if you think defending a state, in the middle of some of the hardest national conversations of our time, was easy, you haven't been paying attention. She glanced briefly at Cameron, then looked away, not dismissively. Just intentionally. I've been called names before. Worse than what you heard tonight. I've been misquoted, mocked, even threatened. I've had protesters outside my house while I tried to make dinner for my family. I've made decisions that people disagreed with. That comes with the territory. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But what I've never done, she said, her voice tightening just slightly, is use a public stage to belittle another woman's looks or question their worth in front of a crowd who just came to learn. A hush swept over the room, like a sudden drop in temperature. I'm not asking you to agree with me. You don't have to like my politics. You don't have to like me. That's your right. But don't confuse disagreement with disrespect. The silence stretched longer. Now Pam shifted gears. Some of you are going to leave this school and enter fields where people will push you, challenge you, even humiliate you. You will be tempted to respond with sarcasm, with venom, with cheap shots that win you applause, but lose you credibility. Her eyes scan the crowd. I'm telling you now, resist that urge. She let the silence breathe again before stepping back from the mic. Just enough to speak without it. Because your voice doesn't have to be the loudest to be heard. A few claps broke out from the back. Then more within seconds. It rolled across the auditorium. Not like a wave, but like a ripple that caught momentum and couldn't be stopped. Cameron didn't move. Her face was blank. Not angry, not amused. Just still. Pam stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat, without a glance toward the crowd. No smile, no gotcha moment. She just sat down and crossed her legs, as if nothing unusual had happened. The moderator blinked, fumbled for the next question. But no one was really listening to him. Now all eyes were still on Pam. But it was what she said next that turned silent disbelief into stunned respect. The applause had faded, but the feeling lingered. Not like excitement. More like the weight of a moment sinking in. The kind that doesn't need to be explained, because everybody feels it at the same time. Pam stayed seated, hands folded neatly on the table. The panel was technically still ongoing, but the discussion had shifted, not just in topic, but in tone. Even the students, who'd been half scrolling on their phones earlier, were now sitting up, alert, like they didn't want to miss anything. Cameron glanced toward the moderator, clearly waiting for him to move things along. But he didn't. The room didn't want more cards or curated prompts. They wanted something real. So Pam gave it to them without being asked. She leaned toward her mic again, her voice quieter this time. You know, she said, when I was in office, I handled a case involving a 15-year-old girl who had been trafficked for nearly 2 years. She was taken by someone who promised her opportunity, someone who looked her in the eye and lied. You could have heard a pin drop. I met her the day after the trial ended. We sat in this sterile beige interview room, and she looked at me like I was just another adult, with empty words. She didn't trust anyone, and why should she? Everyone who claimed to care had used her. Pam's voice didn't crack, she didn't get teary. But there was a softness now. The kind that comes from having lived something, instead of just reading about it. I didn't talk to her about politics. I didn't ask her who she voted for. I sat with her, I listened. And when she asked me why I took her case seriously, When others didn't, I told her something simple. I said, because you matter. Even if no one ever told you that before. The silence turned heavier. A few students shifted in their seats. One girl in the front row blinked hard and pulled her sleeve up to wipe her face. Pam continued. She started crying. Not because of what happened to her. She was used to that pain. She cried because someone had finally treated her like she was worth fighting for. Now the crowd wasn't just listening. They were locked in. You can question my record, Pam said, eyes flicking briefly toward Cameron again. But don't question my reasons. I didn't take this path because it was easy. I took it because, like that girl, I needed someone to fight for me once. And now I do it for others. Her voice was low but steady. That's not a headline, that's not a talking point. That's a life. And for a second, even Cameron didn't have a comeback. The moderator cleared his throat again, trying to find a way to transition. But before he could speak, a young man in a vintage FSU sweatshirt raised his hand. Excuse me, he said a little hesitantly. I came here tonight thinking I wouldn't agree with a single word you said. And politically I still don't. But that story, that mattered. Pam gave him a small nod. Thank you. That means more than you know. More hands started going up. Not to challenge, not to argue. Just to ask. They weren't there for sides anymore. They were there for understanding. Cameron sat still, her fingers lightly tapping her armrest. She looked toward the exit, then back to the panel. For the first time that evening, she looked unsure, and right when it seemed she was done, Pam dropped one final line that nobody will forget. Pam leaned slightly forward, her hands still resting calmly in front of her. She looked toward the back of the auditorium, then slowly swept her gaze across the entire room. Not as a politician trying to score a point, but as someone who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. She paused, and then she said it. If we keep turning disagreement into a weapon, we'll lose the very thing that holds a society together. Respect. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize it. She just said it like a fact. One that had been sitting quietly in the corner all night, waiting for someone brave enough to say it out loud. The moderator stopped flipping through his cards. Cameron stared down at her notepad, but her pen wasn't moving. In the third row, a middle-aged man in a Bucks hat leaned forward, like he just heard something he wasn't expecting. Behind him, a young woman whispered to her friend. That's actually true, though. Pam kept speaking, not to fill the silence, but to make it count. It's easy to mock. It's harder to listen, and if we're honest, most of us are tired not of each other's ideas, but of the way we talk to each other about them. That one hit too. A few people started clapping. At first just polite, but then it spread slow and steady, like a ripple that wouldn't stop. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't performative. It was real. Even some who had laughed earlier now joined in. Cameron didn't clap, but she didn't speak either. She looked straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Pam gave a small appreciative smile. Not smug, not self-satisfied. Just grounded. Then she sat back down. And the strange thing was, no one rushed to speak after that. Not the moderator, not the other panelists. Everyone seemed to know that the moment didn't need to be followed. It needed to breathe. Finally, the moderator cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, Miss Bondi." That was impactful. He looked toward Cameron, clearly offering her a chance to respond. But she just shook her head lightly. Not in dismissal, more like someone who realized the energy in the room had shifted, and she was no longer in control of it. After a pause, the moderator tried to salvage the format. Let's take a few more questions before we wrap up. But the audience wasn't done thinking about what they just heard. A student near the back, a tall guy in a grey hoodie, raised his hand. "I didn't come here expecting to feel anything," he said, standing without waiting for a mic. "I thought it'd be another political argument. But I don't know, that hit different." Some in the audience murmured in agreement. Pam nodded. "I think we all want something better. We just don't always know how to get there without tearing each other apart first." That line didn't make people cheer. It made them sit still because they knew it was true. Cameron finally spoke. Her voice was calm, careful. "Well," she said, "if nothing else, you've mastered the art of silence." Pam turned to her with no hostility in her eyes. "Silence only feels loud when it follows noise." And there it was, the last word. No mic drop, no cheers. Just truth. But it wasn't the applause that made the clip go viral. It was who shared it first shared. The panel ended 10 minutes later. But no one rushed for the exits. Students stood around in small clusters, talking in hushed tones. Some debated what had happened, while others just stood quietly, like they were still trying to process it. Pam didn't linger. She shook a few hands, gave a brief word of thanks to the event organizers, and walked calmly through the side door with 2 aides. No press conference, no selfies. Just a quiet exit, but the real storm was just beginning. By the next morning, a grainy clip of Pam's remarks had already made its way online. It wasn't even professionally recorded. Just someone's iPhone video from the 5th row. The caption was simple: "Pam Bondi just taught a masterclass in class." At first it was just a few hundred shares. Then a few thousand, then came the retweets. Not just from her supporters, but from people who'd never spoken positively about her before. A progressive podcast host from Oregon wrote, "I don't agree with her on almost anything. But this was grace under fire." A student journalist from Miami posted, "I was in that room. I went in thinking one thing. I left rethinking a lot more." Then came the big one. A retweet from a well-known political commentator. Someone with millions of followers, who had openly criticized Bondi for years. He wrote, "Respect isn't partisan. This was powerful." That's when the views exploded. Clips were edited, reactions filmed. Think pieces written, news outlets that would normally never give Pam Bondi the time of day suddenly aired her full remarks. Not to boost her, not even to defend her. Just because people were watching. Meanwhile, Cameron Holt said nothing. She didn't post about the panel. Didn't share any quotes. No behind-the-scenes shots or clever tweets. Her team declined interview requests. When asked for comment by a morning show, her publicist said only no statement. At this time it wasn't a scandal. No one had screamed, nothing technically went wrong. But people noticed something deeper. Something unspoken in a moment. That could have become just another political shouting match. Pam had chosen composure, and people remembered that. The university released a short statement 2 days later, thanking all panelists for their participation and promising more events that encourage thoughtful dialogue. But by then, the moment had taken on a life of its own. At coffee shops around Tampa, people were talking about the panel. Not because of who won or lost, but because of how one woman showed up differently. In an interview a week later, Pam was asked why she responded the way she did. She shrugged. "I wasn't there to win. I was there to represent what I believe. If I had responded with anger, it would have just proven the wrong point." The journalist interviewing her asked, "And what point did you want to make?" Pam smiled that you don't have to be cruel to be strong. That quote ended up on posters in classrooms, on Instagram stories in captions, shared by young women across political lines. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it felt real. And that's why it spread across campuses. Conversations started bubbling up. Students who had been deeply divided began to talk about tone, not just policy. They talked about leadership, about grace, about what it really means to hold your ground without burning everything down around you. And while Cameron's silence was never explained, it didn't need to be. Because in some ways her reaction, or lack of one, was the quiet acknowledgement that she'd been caught off guard. Not by a zinger, not by a takedown, but by something rarer, restraint. But if you think that's where it ends, you'd be wrong. A few weeks after the panel, the buzz began to settle. But something about it stuck with people. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about how quickly a room full of strangers had gone from laughter to stillness. Not because someone yelled, but because someone didn't. In a political science class at Texas Tech, a professor played the clip during a unit on public discourse. Students were asked to write a reflection on what they saw. One junior wrote, "It made me rethink how I argue. I didn't agree with her views, but I respected how she handled it." That was the thing. This wasn't about whether you leaned left or right. It was about character, dignity, the rare strength it takes to hold your ground without pushing someone else off theirs. At a community church event in Flagstaff, Arizona, a guest speaker referenced the moment without even using names. "Sometimes the most powerful person in the room," he said, "is the one who doesn't need to win to make a point." And back at the University of South Florida, students who had attended the panel began organizing something new. Monthly open forums for respectful dialogue between students of opposing views. They didn't call it a debate club. They didn't make it about scoring points. They called it the bridge room, because that's what they wanted to build. None of that had been Bambi's plan. But she heard about it, and one afternoon, sitting in her office overlooking the bay, she got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just a folded note card. Inside on it, in handwriting that looked young and a little messy, were 5 words: "Thanks for not punching back." There was no signature. She kept that card not because it was about her, but because it reminded her that people are always watching. Not just what you say, but how you say it. Not just the stand you take, but the way you carry yourself while taking it. We live in a time where outrage spreads faster than truth, where shouting matches rack up more views than thoughtful moments, but now and then, someone comes along who flips the script. Not by fighting louder, but by refusing to fight dirty. That's what happened in that auditorium. It wasn't about who had the sharpest comeback or the strongest applause line. It was about restraint. About the idea that you don't have to humiliate someone to disagree with them. That you don't have to defend yourself by attacking someone else. Pam Bondi's story reminded people of that. And maybe, just maybe, it gave others the courage to try it too. Because at the end of the day, most people aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for someone to remind them that it's still possible to stand tall without stepping on someone else. And if we're lucky, we'll see more moments like that. The kind that don't just go viral, but actually leave something behind. If this story moved you even just a little, take a moment to think about how you speak to people who disagree with you. Share this video Subscribe and stick around. There are still voices worth hearing. And more stories to be told.